All right, let's dive into one of the most notorious and, frankly, terrifying episodes in American history, the Salem Witch Trials. It's a story about how a community can completely unravel, how fear, superstition, and a broken justice system can turn neighbors into monsters. So, picture this. It's 1692 in colonial Massachusetts. A small, tight-knit Puritan community is about to be consumed by a wave of paranoia so intense it will lead to a series of trials and prosecutions that would leave a permanent scar on the American story. And it happened fast. In just over a year, this hysteria spiraled completely out of control. Think about that for a second. More than 200 people were accused of being witches. And for 19 of them, that accusation was a death sentence. 14 women and 5 men were convicted and then executed by hanging. And then there was one elderly man, Giles Corey. In an incredible act of defiance against the court, he refused to enter a plea. For that, he was pressed to death with heavy stones. It's just a staggering human toll. So the big question is, how on earth did this happen? How does an entire community just completely spiral into a deadly panic like this? Well, to really get the how, you first have to understand the why. You see, the stage was set long before the first finger was pointed. Late 17th century Massachusetts was an absolute tinderbox of anxiety, just waiting for a match. I mean, look at this. It was a perfect storm. Politically, they were in chaos with no legal charter. They were living in constant fear of attacks from nearby conflicts, with refugees pouring in. And on top of all of that, their rigid Puritan faith taught them that the devil wasn't some abstract idea. He was a real active enemy. Oh, and of course, people were feuding with their neighbors over money and land. And to make things worse, there was this deep-seated local rivalry. You had the poorer, farming-focused Salem village, which is where the accusations started, by the way, and the wealthier, more merchant-driven Salem town. That kind of friction and resentment was just simmering right below the surface. And then there's the gender angle, which you just can't ignore. The Puritan worldview held that women were spiritually weaker, and because of that, more likely to give in to the devil. So if you were a woman who didn't quite fit the mold, maybe you were too outspoken or independent, you were already living under a cloud of suspicion. So you have this community just primed for paranoia. The tinderbox is ready. All it needed was a single spark to light the whole thing up. And that spark came from the last place anyone would have expected: the local minister's own house. It's February 1692. Inside the Salem Village parsonage, the Reverend's 9-year-old daughter Betty and his 11-year-old niece Abigail start having these bizarre, violent fits. We're talking screaming, throwing things, their bodies contorting into strange positions. They complained that invisible forces were pinching and pricking them, and when the doctor was called in, he had no earthly explanation. As the panic grew, people pressured the girls. Who was doing this to you? And they pointed their fingers at 3 women: Tituba, an enslaved woman whose cultural background made her an outsider; Sarah Good, a homeless beggar; and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who was unpopular and involved in a legal dispute. Do you see the pattern? They were all social outcasts, the perfect defenseless targets. And it didn't stop there. What started as a weird sickness in 2 young girls exploded into a full-blown legal inferno. It overwhelmed the justice system and spread fear like wildfire through the entire community. By May, the situation was so out of control that the local jails were literally overflowing with accused witches. So the new governor, William Phips, stepped in and created a special court just to hear and determine these cases. And that was a huge deal, because it gave the whole witch hunt the official stamp of approval from the state. Now here's the crazy legal idea that made all of this possible: spectral evidence. Basically, the accusers would claim in court that they saw the ghost or the specter of the accused person tormenting them, and the court made this fatal ruling. They decided the devil couldn't use a person's shape without their permission, so if someone claimed they saw your ghost hurting them, bam, you were guilty. I mean, how do you possibly defend yourself against that? The whole legal process was a joke, a complete sham. It would start with a simple complaint. Then, you'd be dragged into a public hearing where you were basically presumed guilty and badgered to confess. If you refused, you'd be indicted and put on trial, sometimes on the very same day. Due process? Forget about it. It just didn't exist. And the result of that process was a summer of absolute terror. It started with one woman, Bridget Bishop, hanged in June. But then look at the pace. 5 more in July, another 5 in August, and then 8 people hanged in September. The speed of it is just chilling. It shows you how quickly this nightmare escalated. And let's go back to Giles Corey. This 81-year-old farmer knew the court was a sham, so he refused to participate. He wouldn't say guilty or not guilty, so to force a plea, they used this horrific form of torture, piling heavy stones on his chest. For 2 days, they added more and more weight until he was finally crushed to death. It was his final, brutal protest. Even some of the most influential ministers, like Cotton Mather, were wrestling with this. In a letter to the court, he actually warned them against relying only on spectral evidence. He said the devil could absolutely impersonate innocent people. But then, in the very same letter, he urged them to prosecute witches speedily and vigorously. It just shows you the deep theological confusion that was fueling the whole crisis. Eventually, by the fall of 1692, the fever started to break. And what came next was the aftermath, the long, slow, and painful process of reckoning with what had just happened. So, what was the turning point? Well, funny how this works. The accusations started reaching the upper class. Prominent citizens, and even the governor's own wife were named. And suddenly, in October, Governor Phipps stepped in, shut down the special court, and put the brakes on the whole thing. But cleaning up this mess took centuries. A new court in 1693 finally disallowed spectral evidence, and people started getting acquitted. Over the years, there were public apologies and convictions were reversed. But get this, the very last victim wasn't formally exonerated until 2022. 2022, over 300 years later. But maybe the most powerful legacy comes from the victims themselves. Their defiant last words, like Mary Eastie's desperate plea that no more innocent blood be shed, are now literally engraved in stone at the memorial. It's a permanent testament to their integrity in the face of absolute madness. And that leads us to this final, powerful thought from historian George Lincoln Burr. The Salem Witch Trials, he wrote, was the rock on which the theocracy shattered. It was a brutal, unforgettable lesson. It became this huge cautionary tale about the toxic mix of religious extremism, state power, and mass fear. And it forced a re-examination of justice and due process that has echoed throughout American history ever since.